Well, welcome back to What Are You Saying, the realest podcast in the world, the people's podcast where people can not only learn and grow, but also feel heard and seen. I'm Osama.
My name is Muhammad, and welcome to today's episode. It's beautiful when you have a guest, someone that's revered in the community for doing community justice, for doing youth work, also an imam as well. What do you do when you have someone that's a mastered in different fields and different sciences? The person that we have today, yes, holds many titles, might have a master's degree, a bachelor's degree, bachelor of science degree as well. Yes, he might be the first Muslim chaplain in Ontario, especially coming out of the London, Ontario community. Yes, he might be a social support and integration in London and might be doing all these different things. But what do you do when you take into account behind the scenes, when he's alone or when he's doing the work and he's all alone, he's trying to figure out how to do it on a daily basis? This is why we are so happy, so thankful, ecstatic to have Imam Abd Alfatah Twakkal on today's podcast. How are you doing today, Imam? The first question I want to ask you is, when it comes to the work they do all the time, I'm pretty sure you get a lot of phone calls from parents regarding their teens, things that might be going on in school, as well as like indoor the house and stuff like that. And for us growing up in the West, it's one of those things, if you don't have a strong Islamic background, most of the time a lot of teenagers get attached to the culture, whether it's through music, through sports, through entertainment. And when they see Islam, they see it kind of as mechanical, black and white. They don't see like the various colors, the intrinsic, the feeling, the sun that it brings in tranquility and stuff. When you're having these dialogues with these parents and you're trying to tell them that these are the things that might cause them to drift away or might not have that strong connection and foundation, what are the principles you try to relate to parents that makes it more easier to understand how having a strong connection to Allah yourself first is essential, but two, trying to have that connection with your children is going to make a huge difference as opposed to waiting until the end when something might goes wrong?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen, wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Myself being born and raised in Canada, in the West, when you talk about being cultured, I was cultured in terms of being exposed to all the different aspects of Western culture and what is deemed as within popular culture, whether it's in terms of the music or the movies and the generally what are seen as icons, for example, within North American culture. But the idea of being able to retain one's identity as a Muslim and not seeing Islam simply as go through the motions or as something as mechanical. A lot of that has to do with how we are raised and how we understand our own faith tradition when it comes to these deeper aspects. Because if there is a disconnect, I mean, the core of our faith tradition is coming to know and to serve our Lord, subhanahu wa ta'ala, to follow in the footsteps of the Messenger of Allah, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, that Allah describes him in the Quran as وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَاكَ إِلَّا رَحْمَةً لِلْعَالَمِينَ. We have sent you only as a mercy to all of the worlds. And so if we don't have a deeper understanding of our faith, then this is where the disconnect begins and where it starts. And it wasn't until I was able to come to that realization by the grace and the bounty of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in terms of this inward aspect and this nurturing of the spiritual side when it comes to our faith tradition, because there has to be a balance. There's the outward and there's the inward. When we're talking about the outward, that's a starting point in terms of I need to learn, for example, my basic fiqh. I need to learn my rulings. How do I perform the prayers? What are the rulings associated with the prayers? And that's the outward. And so then if I don't start with that and then move towards the inward and I limit myself simply to the outward, where, okay, I know how to pray properly now, but what's the quality of my prayer? Is there a level of khushu' or humility and concentration and awareness in the prayer in terms of what exactly am I doing when I'm standing to perform my prayer? If I don't have that type of connection, then this is where it's easy for doubt to creep in. It's easy for people to sort of lose their way or to think, I've been praying for so long and nothing's happening. Or I've been making dua to Allah for so long and nothing is happening. I don't feel that sense of, spiritual upliftment, etc. This is where, we have to be able to unpack these conversations and to be able to kind of go a little bit deeper to be able to understand what's going on here. And especially in a society that is so secular, that is so is trying to divorce spirituality from the material. And it's just all about materialism. It's all about sensual pleasure. It's all about, feeling good within oneself that is not without any sort of parameters or boundaries to that regard. Because if it's about the nafs, then this can be problematic depending on where my nafs is. What's the state of my nafs? Inna nafsa la'ammaratun bisu'. That the nafs can be in a state where it's inclining towards evil. It's inclining towards indulgence in that which is pleasurable and whatnot, without any regard for the limits and boundaries that have been placed by Allah through the guidance of the Sharia and the Quran and the Sunnah of our Messenger. And so it's a deep conversation. And if we limit it to simply just the outward, then people don't necessarily see the depth of our tradition such that we can start walking towards that and develop that within ourselves.
MashaAllah, thank you for that beautiful answer. I know when we spoke on the phone earlier, we spoke of a lot of stuff, and inshallah, which we'll get to later in our conversation. You've mentioned that you were obviously a chaplain police at London for 7 years, and you're your first Muslim chaplain in Ontario, Central Division, formerly O Division, which inshallah we'll get to in a few. But I want you to talk about Islamophobia, the hate crimes that you've noticed, the incidents, if you could talk about stories you've seen, things you've experienced, all that kind of great stuff.
Sure. So, I mean, this is a challenging conversation, to have, and it's important, for people who are listening, that this can be actually triggering if they've experienced or seen any sort of incidences that cause harm within themselves because of their faith and whatnot. So it's important that we acknowledge that, and for people to ensure that they take care of themselves and that they reach out for help and support when needed. When it comes to the rising rate of Islamophobia and discrimination, I mean, discrimination and racism have existed in our society for time immemorial. It's for indefinitely, it's existed for so long. And there's a lot of history when it comes to the various forms of racism and discrimination. We have seen an uptick in incidences that are related to Islam and Muslims, Islamophobia, that there definitely has been an increase, and especially post September 11th. There was a lot of misconceptions, and when we're talking about the portrayal of Muslims in popular media, in movies and things like that, the general stereotypes are all there in terms of being terrorists and condoning violence as a means to spread Islam, etc. Post 9/11, then we're dealing with a different beast, so to speak, because it becomes much more pronounced, and the focus then becomes more so on the faith tradition in and of itself rather than Muslims and that link with violence. And so here in Canada, for example, when we're talking about the incidences of Islamophobia, of course, one of the first major incidences that took place was in Quebec, in the Quebec City mosque massacre or shooting. In 2017, January the 29th, 2017, where 6 members of the Quebec City Islamic Cultural Center, that community, they were killed, and there were many injured in that. And that was sort of like a first wake-up call for our community and for our society in general to be able to understand the impact that hatred has. But there's a build-up to that. None of this happens in a vacuum. In terms of when you look in the media and the sensationalization that exists with all the different headlines that are related to Islam and Muslims all over the world, whether it's in the UK or in North America or in other places in Europe, there's this sensationalism that and this building of tropes and misconceptions and myths that really aren't true. So, they're fabrications, they're false narratives, so to speak. And so with the increase of the influence online and with the online hate increasing and all the virulence that exists in the online world against Islam and against Muslims, it then becomes a factor that contributes to people becoming more emboldened, where they have these racist, discriminatory views within themselves and they remain unchecked. But now it's not just simply a matter of harboring the sentiments within themselves. Now they feel more emboldened to actually express them. And then going further and taking actions to say, well, our values are under attack and we need to stand up for, who we are as Canadians and to be able to fight against all these foreign influences that are trying to take over our country and, creeping Sharia and all these different things that come about that people view that, okay, these are real and they're threats. when in fact the reality or the truth of the matter is that no, these are actually racist views and tropes that aren't true, and that are contributing to this underbelly, so to speak, of hatred that exists within our society, and then it rears its ugly head in the form of these acts of discrimination that lead to, the most extreme, which is what we witnessed in Quebec City in 2017. Here in London, Ontario, of course, we had the killing of our London family that took place in 2021. When we look at, what led up to that, and when you sort of peer into the viewpoints and the mindset of the terrorist, the individual who went down the rabbit hole based on his own testimony and confession, that, when he committed this atrocious, egregious terrorist act in 2021 on June the 6th. And I knew the family, like the brother Salman, rahmatullahi alayh. He was a regular attendee of the London Muslim Mosque, where I served as an imam for 5 years, and I would see him all the time in the masjid. And so this was devastating on our community, that so many people knew the family members, and they were killed solely and only and exclusively for the reason that they were Muslim. There was no other reason. And they were targeted based on their dress, that they were Muslim. That was the only reason why they were targeted. Yep. The perpetrator, the terrorist who committed this act, he did not know them, but he simply targeted them because they were Muslim, and it ended up, losing 3 generations of a family in a single blow, right? So there has been an increase in the hate crimes and the hate incidences and the rhetoric, and that there's been a build-up. So even if you look at the statistics, from starting in 2019, Statistics Canada actually records the police reported hate crimes. And so in 2019, the number was 1,951 in terms of those that are police-reported hate crimes. Those are not obviously taking into consideration what goes unreported, which is the vast majority of incidences. Most of these incidences are not actually reported. And in the same year, 2019, the General Statistics Survey of Canada, they had recorded around 223,000 incidences, self-reported incidences of hatred or Islamophobia or whatnot, hate incidences. And so when you compare the numbers, 223,000 with 1,951, you're talking about less than 1% of these things are actually being reported. And so then as the years progress, from 2019 to 2020, there is an increase in the number of police-reported hate crimes. It's over 2,000. The most recent figures that we have are from 2023, and the figure it stood at 4,770 some. So now you're getting close to 5,000, to almost 4,800 hate crimes that are actually reported to the police. It's not necessarily showing an accurate picture of what's happening on the ground, simply because these are the crimes that have actually been reported. Okay, it doesn't talk about what hasn't been reported. But this is part of our efforts within the community, is that, one, we need to remove barriers that prevent people from talking about these incidences to police and to reporting them. And so I've had many examples where people will call me up because they know my role within the community as an imam, as well as a chaplain with the London Police Service and a chaplain with the RCMP and whatnot. I have a lot of interactions with law enforcement and engagement with them, and they're very supportive of our community, and they want to resolve and make our community safe for everybody, of course, regardless of their background and faith and beliefs and whatnot. And so people will come to me and they'll tell me about incidences that have happened to them, whether it's being spat at, whether it's being threatened or told off, whether it's being sworn at, whether it's actually being physically assaulted. All of these examples of incidents, this is just happening here in London, right? Where there are a lot of these racist undertones that exist within our community. And so we need to be able to address these racist discriminatory undertones that exist, because that is something that can lead to, when people, they become more emboldened. And even when it comes to on a political level, the rhetoric that politicians use, which is very divisive. We see the impact that has on the ground, and the changes in people's attitudes, or at the very least their emboldening that takes place, where now people are no longer afraid to violate the rights of another person in front of them, simply because they see themselves as better based on the color of their skin or based on their beliefs or whatever it is. And that's at the root of any form of discrimination and racism. It's two things. It's arrogance and it's ignorance, right?
And it's beautiful how you encapsulated all that. And it makes me think about history in itself. If you think about colonialism and how like this country primarily is founded through like a white settler structure system. So through that, and even through the works, because you talked about decentralization, especially through the media. If you're talking about academia itself, you could look at Orientalism, right, as a perfect example. So even through their works, they talk about how people, primarily in Islamic countries and states at that time, were seen as primitive or backwards, based on their living, their standards, and obviously the religion itself. So it's kind of amazing as far as the parallels, how it ties in today. The same thing through the media, centralization, or even academic works. Those who are far right might try to portray people, especially through Muslims, how they are even today. 9/11, we were very young when it happened. We were children at that time. But even such a catastrophic event made a lot of Muslims second guess what to do, where to go to for safety, because something happened that you've never seen. It changed the paradigm in terms of security amongst traveling between countries, how people are viewed as far as walking outside, and primarily identity. So I want to ask you this question, because anytime like an incident happens against a community, especially against Muslims, when something like this happens, obviously we look towards for justice. We try to confine in the police, we try to confine in the courts, we try to confide through the judicial system, do the right thing, but sometimes it might not do the right thing. Obviously because of these standards and these systems that sometimes might be used against us. When these things happen, sometimes people, instead of thinking like, if I'm a Muslim, during this time, you try to ask Allah for help, and at the same time, you try to do what you can on a small level, as far as talking with your neighbors, talking to your local council, schools, try to do like passive dawah to create meaningful, bondful conversations. If you're not comfortable, ask your local imam or local politician to create that conversation that could kind of change the nucleus. But if people feel as if they can't do that, most of the time we find that people conform. So that might be through the self-identity of removing the hijab, or might not using your full Muslim name when it comes to applications, or just going around so you can feel safe. So you self-identify as the normal standard of those who only oppress, as opposed to identifying who you are as a Muslim. So when these things happen, what do you say to people as far as it's okay to feel afraid, but at the same time do not lose self-identity of who you are, feeling as if you have to conform to something which you're truly not, just for the fact of wanting to be safe?
So, I mean, that's a very deep question, because every person's own experience is going to be different and unique, so to speak. If people come seeking advice, to myself, I will say, we don't have to give up who we are as our identity. And we live in a country that at the core of it, in terms of the fundamental rights that are enshrined in, the freedom of charter and rights and whatnot in the Constitution, this is something that allows us to be able to practice our faith, to be who we are as we see fit, and that we don't have to give that up. And there's this dichotomy that people sometimes have in their minds that, okay, I have to choose between my Islamic identity and my Canadian identity, for example, because there's a conflict, or there's a clash, when we talk about the clash of civilizations and whatnot. But again, these are tropes. These are things that aren't accurate when it comes to how it is that I navigate my identity, and especially in a society where nowadays any outward expression of my faith can actually increase the risk factors against me for being told off or whatnot. And so everyone's experience is different. Everyone's level of sort of what they can quote unquote tolerate differs, as well as how strong they feel in that identity. If somebody, it resonates with them very strongly in terms of their faith and the practice of the faith, and especially when we look at our sisters, that they're most often put at risk when it comes to the outward visibility. And there's also another element to this, which is the intersectionality. That, you know, if somebody is of like a minority background, that they're black and that they're or indigenous, and then they wear the hijab, and then they're women, you know, sisters, or they're women. That then there are several different layers to an intersectionality in terms of their identity, each of which can increase sort of the risks upon them if they don't conform to what it is that, you know, well, I want to assimilate rather than integrate. And what's the difference between the two? Assimilation, based on my understanding, is where a person is just like, okay, I want to be able to conform with, you know, what is the general viewpoints and perspectives of people, and how it is that I should, quote unquote, be Canadian, right? I have to conform to their other people's, or the vast majority of people's, understanding. And this is the melting pot model, which is more like in America, where all the different cultures and all the different, you know, traditions and things like that, it's into a melting pot where everything is melted so that you have more of a, you know, like something that is more uniform, right? This is different than the mixing pot. The mixing pot is kind of like the salad, where you bring all the different elements of the salad together, but they're not assimilating into one another, but they're still able to maintain their unique characteristics and traits and attributes in the diversity. So you know, you'll have the lettuce, and you'll have the tomatoes and the cucumbers and the carrots and the onions and all that, those things that you put into a salad, but it's not like you're putting it into a blender and then, you know, here's your and so the mixing pot model is what allows for sort of the multiculturalism and the diversity to exist within, while maintaining our identities that were distinct, right? And so then me walking out in the street in my garments as an imam, or, you know, with my jubba and my thawb and my hat and whatnot, this is Canadian in the sense of it allows me, the country allows me to express myself as my in terms of my faith and my identity, and it's perfectly fine as a Canadian, just like somebody coming from a different country, whether it's Africa or Southeast Asia or whatever, and that they're allowed to manifest their cultures in this beautiful mosaic that we call Canada, right? This is the mixing pot model rather than the melting pot. And so this is more than, it's about, okay, integration. How do I integrate myself? Because if somebody comes to me and says, go back to where you came from, I was born and raised in Canada. Where do you want me to go? Like, I was born here, literally. And I'll make a joke and I'll say to people, well, then just cut me a one-way ticket on a WestJet flight back to Calgary, because that's where I was born, right? You tell me to go home, you know. But what you had mentioned in terms of that colonial mindset is something that it's at, you know, those are roots that exist within the Canadian experience, and we can never lose sight of that. And, you know, the horrors that the indigenous people of these lands suffered through and continue to experience, you know, this is something that we can never forget about. Because when it comes to these mindsets, right, somebody comes and it's like, oh, you're an immigrant. The difference is only maybe 100 years. Because if somebody comes and says, oh, well, I'm a fifth generation Canadian and my ancestors built this land, and, you know, you shouldn't be here, right? By the way, I've had somebody say that to me. And I think to myself, it's like, okay, but you're also an immigrant as well, by the way. The only people who aren't immigrants are those who are First Nations and Inuit and Métis. The Aboriginal people, the indigenous people of Turtle Island. They're the ones who, they were here always. Everyone else, we're all immigrants, and it's just a matter of time. Mm-hmm. And so that arrogance, that sense of, you know, that, oh, I built this country and I'm better than you. And it's that whole colonial mindset. We can never lose sight of that and forget about, you know, the origins, and even the language that you had mentioned about looking at Muslims as being savages or barbaric. It wasn't too long ago that, you know, we had a law in 2015 that was established about, you know, the Act on the Culturally Barbaric Practices or something like that. That's literally what the name of the act was. It used those words, culturally barbaric practices. And then there was like a hotline that was established to report these culturally barbaric practices. And it's like, what are you talking about? Like, based on whose understanding and whose definition? But it's this othering. It's the dehumanization. It's like not being able to see the people for who they are and their diversity. Doesn't mean that we can't disagree. We can agree to disagree. But that does not mean that it allows me, my disagreement with somebody in no way, shape, or form allows me to violate their basic and fundamental human rights. And that's something that we need to strive and work to get to. And so then if people are asking me about, okay, well, is it safe for me to walk in the streets with a sister, for example, wearing her hijab in this climate? That's up to the sister to be able to decide, and determine for herself, because I cannot deny her feelings of fear or lack of safety based on the incidences that are happening. I have to be able to acknowledge that. But to what degree that they feel that they can, they're willing to take on certain risks or to walk out and to stand up for themselves and to say, this is who I am and whatnot, that's going to differ. There's no sort of one-size-fits-all type of remedy to this. But what needs to happen, and this is something that we have to agree to, the common thread, is that there's no place in our society for any form of hatred or racism or discrimination in any way, shape, or form. That's the common denominator that we have to get to. And that just because somebody is different does not mean that they're better or worse. And this othering and this creating of the dichotomy of us versus them and whatnot. And that's what happens in all these different cases where people are being oppressed. There's a dehumanization. You don't see the common humanity in people, and then that allows them to be able to treat them as if they're lower, as if they're lesser. And that's a fundamental core problem, an issue that must be addressed, and we have to continue to address it. And so I'll say to people, don't give up your identity or who you are. How comfortable you feel in terms of expressing it, that's up to you. And everyone's at their different space in their journey. They're at a different point in their spiritual journeys, or how closely affiliated they feel towards their traditions or their beliefs or whatnot. Everyone's at a different point in that spectrum. And so, like I said, it's not a one-size-fits-all. But these are things that we have to take into consideration and then empower people to be able to make these decisions for themselves. So that, if I walk out like this and something happens to me because I'm dressed like this, I'm prepared to deal with that. Personally, that's for me. Other people, they might not be, they feel as equipped or whatnot to be able to do that.
No, definitely. Like, everything you just said, I definitely agree with. And I think that to my next question leading up to it is obviously being a chaplain within London, you mean RCMP, because you mentioned stuff like the misconception, how Muslims are viewed. People are changing their name to try to assimilate with different cultures. Like sometimes, for like me myself, for example, I watch hockey. I'm not gonna change my name to Osama to Sam. Like even after 9/11, as Muhammad mentioned, it was actually the teachers had asked, "Do I want to change my name?" And I remember the answer I gave them, like, no. They kind of probably they didn't understand, but to me, I was like, no. Osama ibn Zayd was like a leader at a young age. So in my head, I'm like, I was so comfortable with my name. Doesn't matter how much of the hate came. But they looked at it from a point of view saying, "Oh, let's name him Sam, and maybe we can just take away from his identity." But for me, I kind of stood straight. I was only like 9 years old, didn't really understand what 9/11 was, but understood there was a different view towards Muslims. Now, obviously, you becoming an RCMP, you becoming a chaplain in the RCMP and London. Talk about what you did, because me and you spoke over the phone. You said there's a lot of misconceptions that your fellow people in London saw, and how you changed those perspectives, like how you made people see Muslims in light. Because as you said, 10 years ago, there was a law, even a law that was about to be passed by the conservative government where they wanted to make Muslims second-class citizens. So how did you go out of your way to change these perspectives, change the misconceptions with the London police and the RCMP?
Sure. So, I mean, really, it has to do with engaging in these conversations with the people who are at the helm, with those who can make a difference and have an impact in these different organizations. I mean, I'll give you an example when it comes to the RCMP. I mean, the history of my involvement or engagement with the RCMP, and mind you, it's all on a volunteer basis. It's not like a paid position or anything of that sort when it comes to being a chaplain with the RCMP or with the London Police Service. But early on, when it came to being able to have these conversations with community, in general, law enforcement agencies, they came to an understanding that in order for us to be able to do our job as law enforcement, we need to be able to engage with communities. Because if we don't engage with communities, to be able to understand them better, to be able to see, for example, some of the cultural nuances, to be to be more culturally integrated when it comes to our responses or how we deal with members coming from such diverse, communities. Without having those conversations, it's going to make our job as law enforcement more difficult. And so, these conversations weren't happening 15, 20 years ago. But then as more and more community engagement took place, I mean, here in London, Ontario, we have a very strong relationship with the law enforcement agencies, especially, like with the London Police Service, in terms of that level of engagement. We have Muslim officers who, are part of the London Police Service, and they're part of the diversity unit, and they're part of the hate crimes unit. And these conversations are constantly happening just in terms of, well, let's educate, the law enforcement agencies in terms of what are some of the beliefs, what are some of the nuances to take into consideration when it comes to dealing or addressing with members of the Muslim community, for example. And that's the example that I can give simply because it's based on my own personal experience and our experience here as a community. And so they understand the impact that has in terms of when you take new recruits, for example, of the London Police Service, and they go and they visit a synagogue, they go and they visit a church, they go and they visit a mosque, and they get a tour, and they get an introduction to the faith tradition, and they get to know, their communities better. When you have officers that will go and engage with, for example, the indigenous, and to be able to visit the indigenous reserves and to be able to understand better those communities, so that they get a sense of, well, what are some of the things that we weren't necessarily thinking about, didn't have those perspectives, right? When it came to the RCMP, I'll tell you a story that is a concrete example of change that took place on the ground. I've been a chaplain with the RCMP since 2022. And so in 2023, I was giving a workshop that was during the time of the commemoration of the Our London family killing. And so every year in the first week of June, since the attack took place in 2021, every subsequent year there are activities within our community that are intended to educate people and to commemorate, bring awareness to what took place and how to be able to sort of address this issue at its core in terms of the racism and the discrimination, etc. So one of these workshops that I was giving was on understanding misconceptions. And the way that this workshop was set up was very clever. This was done by the London Middlesex Local Immigration Partnership, the LMLIP. And they were the ones who designed this workshop, and they just asked me to sort of execute it. What they did, they had around 70 people that had signed up for this workshop. And they said to the participants, we're going to divide you into 6 different groups. And there are 6 different topics about Islam that we want you to go and to research them on the internet. So one was about interfaith, looking at how does Islam view Christianity and Judaism. One was about LGBTQ. One was about jihad and the concept of jihad, right, in Islam. So the exercise was that they would go research for 10, 15 minutes on their phones or whatever, and then they'd write down the results of their research, and then they'd come back and then they'd present it to the group. And then my role was then to be able to either confirm or correct, so to speak, if there were any sort of misconceptions and what does Islam really say about these different concepts. So when I spoke about jihad, and I was saying this is a noble concept in Islam, and it's not holy war, and there's nothing holy about war, and it means struggle, and it's not just about the martial element or aspect of military expeditions and things like that. No, that there's a genuine nobleness in terms of that inward struggle, and the difference between al-jihad al-akbar and jihad al-asghar, the greater jihad and the lesser jihad, referring to the struggle within the self as opposed to the struggle that is, with the military or the martial aspect of it. And even with the martial aspect, there are parameters, there are conditions, there are boundaries and limits, that must be adhered to, and it can only be through a legitimate authority within, the Muslim community, like a central authority or figure or whatnot. So all these different aspects and nuances, and just being able to present that to people in a basic way without going into so many details. So one of the individuals that was actually present and had signed up for this workshop was a senior officer with the RCMP. And so in London, Ontario, the headquarters for all of the RCMP in Ontario is actually in London. It's not in Toronto. And so the RCMP headquarters is here in London. And so this senior officer, he was like very high up in his position with the RCMP. His name is Matt Peggs. And so he was present. And so when he heard what I was talking about, he came to me afterwards and he said, he introduced himself and with the RCMP and whatnot. He's a very humble human being. And the fact that he showed up and was there showed that there's some genuine effort on his part to be able to, he's looking to improve how things are done in the RCMP and whatnot. So he asked me and he said, I didn't know this about jihad and the concept of jihad. And he recalled how in the past, when RCMP, they lay charges, they put out communications that are on a national level in terms of the charges that are laid. And he was telling me that some of the language that they'd used in the past, when it came to individuals that were Muslim and that they were a part of a terrorist group or whatever, the language that they would be using is, they would refer to them as like they were a jihadi, right? And so then when he heard that jihad is a noble concept, he's like, we're not getting something here. There's something that we're missing, right? So he came to me and he started that conversation and he asked, would we be able to meet afterwards and to be able to sort of unpack this and to engage more? I said, absolutely. And so we continued having these meetings and conversations, and then I ended up getting members from, the National Council of Canadian Muslims, the NCCM, and we actually ended up having a meeting at one of the detachments of the RCMP in Ontario, where this individual, who he actually then became the head of the RCMP in all of Ontario. So he's currently the regional commander, which is like the commanding officer, and he's assistant commissioner of the RCMP. And of course, the commissioner is at the national level, so he's an assistant commissioner. So he has a very high position. So he arranged for a meeting to bring in the communications people in Ontario of RCMP, those who are responsible for putting together these communications. And what we did was we analyzed a number of past communications that had been put out by the RCMP looking at the language. And we saw a very clear difference and demarcation when it came to, if this person was charged with a terrorist activity, if they're Muslim, as opposed to if they were not Muslim. If they're Muslim, it mentions Islamic State or Daesh or Jihadi or whatnot. Whereas, when we looked at, the case of Our London Family, he was charged with terrorist activity. Nothing about Christianity. He was a fundamentalist Christian. He wrote his own manifesto about the Great Replacement and whatnot, and he talked about his upbringing as in a fundamentalist Christian background, etc. None of that is mentioned. And so he was saying, the regional commander, he was saying that the language that we use, is this causing harm to the Muslim community? Because when they mention the Muslim, to say that, okay, yes, they're a member of the Islamic State, or that people don't understand necessarily ISIS, they just see Islamic. They see that the adjective, the describer, and then it's associated with everything about Islam and Muslims, and it all gets lopped into the same category. Same thing with jihadi, right? It's like it's all lopped into the same category: terrorist and the fundamentalist and violence and all this, all these other stereotypes and tropes that come alongside with it, all the baggage, so to speak. And so after doing this analysis, it became very clear. It's like, okay, why is there a difference? What is it that the RCMP want to speak to? They want to say that this individual was charged with terrorist activity based on a listed terrorist entity. And so I said, why don't you just simply use that language without mentioning ISIS, without mentioning Daesh, without mentioning jihadi, Islamic, anything of that sort? And they're like, makes sense. Why not? And so then any subsequent communication that came out, there was no mention of anything that would relate individuals to Islamic or the Muslim community in any way, shape, or form, because they understood at that point that this is causing harm on a much wider scale, that when they're communicating these terms and the misuse of these terms with the public. And so they took that concrete step. And when they issued subsequent communications laying terrorist charges against Muslims, right? The only thing that you could say is just this person, and they have a Muslim name, but there's nothing to say that of their association with Islamic State or anything of that sort, because they understood now, okay, this is a dynamic that can actually cause harm to the community, so we're going to shift it. And so that was something that that's their policy now here in Ontario. That, whenever these communications are being put out, they only talk about the charge, the action that was done that was contravening the criminal code, and that's it. There's no need to be able to associate them with Islamic or anything of that sort, right? So that's a concrete example. That would not have happened had there not been this community engagement, had there not been this building of relationships, had there not been this willingness to, okay, well, these are difficult, challenging conversations, let's have them. and continue to have them. So that's just one example of many where it's just like, okay, they're willing to engage. Let's engage. If we have questions, because by the way, the misconceptions don't only exist from one side or on one end. They go back and forth. When people talk about RCMP, there are misconceptions and there is a lot of mistrust that exists. How do we help build those relationships where it's just like, okay, let's do some concrete action and work on the ground where we can help to remove the misconceptions and the misunderstandings that exist. And it's not to say that there aren't systemic issues. There are, and we can talk about those and we can deal with them. But let's have those conversations and to work towards that. And so when you have individuals that are at the head of these organizations that are willing to have these conversations, not just for the sake of, it's not tokenism. I'm not a fan of tokenism, where it's just about, okay, I can check off on my diversity, equity, and inclusion boxes that, okay, I've done this. I can check it off. No. This is talking about real impact and change on the ground, that we want to make our communities safer. We want to make this safe for everyone. We want to be impartial. We want to be neutral. We want to do our job as law enforcement, etc. And so this is how change happens on the ground, is by able to having these and engaging in these challenging, difficult conversations and seeing, okay, well, what are some steps, concrete steps that we can do to affect this change? Right? And that's something that's ongoing. And so we need to engage, and we need to remain engaged in terms of being able to understand and approach things with not being naive, but also at the same time being able to give the benefit of the doubt at times. And if there are things that are glaring and that are, violations or that are systemic issues, let's talk about them. Let's address them, right? Because if we don't have that conversation, then, and we just have these feelings of mistrust and, oh, well, there's something going on and they're doing this and they're doing that and they really want to undermine our community. All these experiences that I've had are telling me that no, it's not about undermining the community. But if you have concerns, let's bring them to the table. Let's have these. And it's about being informed at the same time. Not based on, things that I came up with in my mind and I tried to put two and two together and it's like, oh, that's what they meant. Not necessarily. There's a lot more to it than meets the eye, and we have to address these misconceptions at times to be able to sort of build that sense of community and relationship.
Such an impactful, beautiful answer. There's so much to unpack. Where I want to start from is the whole aspect of the reactive stance and mentality. So anytime, like you said, you have one side, the Muslim community, the other side, the RCMP. Through trials and tribulations, you over time collect data, an idea, and a perception about a group of people or an organization.
Sure.
And because of that, most of the time, until something happens, that's when you meet in the middle. Most of the time, it's bad dialogue, and it's just spewing tasteful rhetoric, and it leaves a negative impression over time. As you talked about in the beginning, the fact that on their end, they realized that they had to make a change, whether they liked it or not, because nothing is progressive happening as far as constant dialogue, and we are seen more as the enemy as opposed to something that's helpful, which we do every single day as officers. And at the other end, in the Muslim community, they fend for themselves and they don't feel as if they have to resort to others outside for help because they're not getting any answers. So for the RCMP to take that step, that initiative, that open pathway, and for you to be that person as well, to take on that stance, shows the difference between a reactive mentality as opposed to a response mechanism. First word, opinion and stance as far as helpful dialogue, constant communication, and just you talking and having that conversation with the senior commander. And the idea and the evidence, the fact that all these cases and all these people, that communication as far as who they are, what they were tried with, and the extra language, the negative language that was used against them, like you said, because of the media and stuff like that, and things we talked about, the colonial aspect and everything, Islam unfortunately might get like a generalized brushstroke. So ISIS, Al-Qaeda, like any Islamist military group, they cannot differentiate the difference between that and like Sunni and different Orthodox sects in the religion as well, right? So the fact that you were able to have these dialogues and these exercises, and it showed him the difference as far as these questions, these concepts, and that breakthrough translate into a social cleansing, ethnic cleansing, a religious cleansing on their ideas of what this religion has to offer.
Let's be careful with that. Be careful of that term, ethnic cleansing. That it means something.
Oh, sorry, not in that aspect as far as like, not in that aspect as far as that. I meant in the aspect of just erasing the misconceptions
I understand what you meant.
that's associated with such prescribed groups and stuff, right? So, but if you
just for the listeners, so that they don't misunderstand. Just to be clear.
Yeah, someone's gonna take it the wrong way. But if you did not take these steps and initiatives, it would continue on till this day, and it's only gonna create more problems. So I think you pretty much talked about community work as far as the things that you do, as far as the interfaith aspect amongst different religions and different communities, as well as where you guys live, as well as the youth engagement in the media, because you will make public appearances when needed as far as asking questions about what's going on. With this breakthrough and what you've been doing for the past few years, is there anything that still surprises you when you still get some negative reactions from people in the Muslim community, like as far as where you are, as far as why you're doing these work, despite the success you might be doing on the other side as well, from RCMP officers saying that despite you clarifying all these different things, I'm still not figuring it out, or I'm still not satisfied with how Islam in terms of this aspect is justified? Like, how do you try to deal with those things still going on to this day?
Well, I need to be able to understand where people are at and meet them there. Okay, so if somebody, for example, their experience has always been negative when it comes to law enforcement, right? And they have already sort of built up in their minds and based on their experiences and their understandings and their perceptions and their knowledge, however much it is, whether it's limited or a lot, they already have built up within themselves these perceptions. So my role as a community leader would be, okay, one, are you willing to have this conversation? Do you want to unpack some of these things because if a person is not willing to take a step back and check themselves, do I have implicit biases based on my negative experience? I'm not denying your negative experience, but is there a way that you'd like to sort of talk about this to see, okay, you did go through something that was horrible, it shouldn't have happened. What are the steps that we can take to address that, not just on a personal level, but on a systemic level, in terms of, okay, well, there was an officer that did this and did that, or whatever, or your engagement with RCM. And we have to also be very cognizant and careful of where we're getting our information from. Because if I'm getting my information from news headlines, and then I read through news articles, and then this becomes a truth. Whereas, well, I don't know if, even with the news articles, which news agency are we talking about? Is there a tendency to sort of spin things in a certain way? And media will do that. And we know that that happens all the time. And that's what's informing me about what's taking place. I need to get to the bottom of that. Is that really true in terms of what I've read? And I look into it. And it's not just a matter of looking into it where I just search the internet and I comb through all the resources and whatever is out there on the internet and try to sift through it. No, it's like, okay, well, let me have that conversation with somebody who has experience, has knowledge. The Quran, it says, فَذِكْرِ إِن كُنْتُمْ لَا تَعْلَمُونَ. Ask the people of knowledge if you don't know. Right? Those people who have experience, that have been engaged. I've been engaged in this work on the ground. And the point of the matter is, if somebody's going to look at me as for example, like a fifth column, or someone that I'm trying to undermine, the community and try to bring in, paint a nice, big, beautiful picture of, law enforcement or whatever, because, oh, well, I have that bias or whatnot. It's okay, come talk to me about that. I'll tell you about my experiences. You want to have challenging, difficult conversations. Let's have those challenging, difficult conversations so that we can try to address these perceptions that you might have, which may have a basis and may not. But if I'm not willing to take that step back and to test my own implicit biases that I might have because of what I saw on the internet or my experiences or whatever, I have to constantly be checking myself. So when you have individuals that are willing to do that on sort of both sides, and they're willing to engage in that type of dialogue, and it's like, okay, let's get an understanding. What's going on here? What exactly is happening, right? That's the only way that you're going to be able to address some of these more systemic issues. And it's okay to have these challenging conversations. And so when you find people that are willing to do that in positions of power and authority, absolutely, then have it. And then if the conclusion is that, oh, we heard you and we're not going to do anything about it, then it's just like, okay, well, then we have a different set of steps that we can take to say, well, I had this conversation, nothing came about from it. But if I'm not even willing to engage in that in the first place, and I already have my ideas and, it's like, well, they're all about this and they're all about that, when it actually might not be the case. As a Muslim, this is a trust, this is an amana that I have to, and I'm not saying that my understanding is perfect and I know everything, absolutely not. But I mean, yourselves being involved in law enforcement or whatnot. I mean, when I went and I presented at the Ontario Police College, This is the first time that I presented to a group of 500 police recruits that are coming from all over the province and getting their training at the Ontario Police College. This is the first time that they had asked me to come and to present on Islamophobia and the impact of hate crimes on the community and whatnot, right? Those conversations, those presentations, that dialogue needs to happen on all these different levels, you know. Same thing when I had, like, with the York Regional Police. They invited me on in several different occasions to address their annual hate crime awareness conference, right? And I've gone there multiple times to be able to talk about that. And that's where these connections are being made, and people, you know, hear about these levels of engagement, and we want to expand that. We want to be able to benefit, you know, from that. But if there's not that willingness, there's a lack of willingness to be able to engage in these types of conversations, then you're not going to be able to sort of break down some of these barriers or some of these misunderstandings that exist. And that's constant work. It doesn't end. And because, you know, there'll always be issues, or there'll always be things that we can do to improve ourselves and to make things better, whether it's as a community or as a community leader or as a law enforcement agency or whatever. There always has to be this sense of introspection and, you know, evaluating and reevaluating and assessment and reassessment in terms of, okay, are we causing harm? How can we mitigate this? How can we, you know, change the way that we're doing things or talking about things to ensure that we're not a part of the problem, but we're a part of the solution, right? And that's something that is so important and critical, that we maintain those conversations on these different levels.
Absolutely. And there's so many things I want to touch on. Such a beautiful answer. And I think you said knowledge. I believe knowledge is so important, because incidents like Quebec, like London, even just recently Oshawa, where the woman got her hijab ripped off by those like high school students, would be avoided because of, and one of my favorite quotes, just to add on to my point, is if you don't read the news, you're not informed, but if you do read the news, you're misinformed. And I always look at it in the sense of, if I see a YouTube video and it says Muslim fights, or like two Muslims are fighting different ethnicities, for example, right? Imagine the title being somewhat misleading, but you have to watch the video or the article in full context for you to understand what's actually happening. And to even to your point, which I love, is you have to have these conversations, which is going to lead me to my next question. So we did ask you a bit about how you changed the RCMP and the London Police perspective of Islam, but how did you help the Muslims change their perception of police? Because of course police have a 50-50 perception. Some people are for it, some people are against it. Sometimes they feel like as if, sometimes you hear Muslims say, oh, police hate us because we're against Muslims, or they get pulled over. But in reality, sometimes, of course, police officers are here to like protect us, keep us safe. And yes, I think it's a case-by-case scenario. Not everyone's like, again, not every engineer is a good engineer, not every doctor is a good doctor, not every police officer is a good police officer. But my question to you is, what steps did you take to ensure your community of Muslims are having a good reception of the police officers within the London area, and even RCMP as well?
No, that's a great question, because as I'd mentioned, you know, this is a mutual relationship. It's not one way. And so part of that has to do with inviting them to our institutions, to our masajid, and allowing them to be able to interact with members of the community. So if you have questions, if you have these understandings about the London Police or about the RCMP or whatever community you happen to be in, right? Let's engage. Let's come to the mosque. I mean, recently, for example, this happened maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, the first time in the history of our community where the entire senior command of the London Police Service, they came to the London Muslim Mosque for a tour and for breaking bread together. We had a meal, and that experience was very powerful. You know, you had the chief, the deputy chiefs, many of the superintendents and the inspectors. This is like the top brass of the London Police Service. All all of them, or if not the vast majority of them, they all came to the London Muslim Mosque, and we had this level of engagement. And then we talked to the community about that. They're willing to come to our places of worship. They're willing to talk to us and listen to us and learn more about us and to engage with us and whatnot, right? And so when we showcase that to our community members, another example, we had maybe a few months ago, for the first time, we had a Muslim member of the RCMP that came from their recruitment unit and came and gave a workshop in the mosque on what the RCMP does, and if anyone was interested in a career with the RCMP for recruiting purposes, right? I mean, how did you hear about the jobs of policing in terms of in your respective communities or whatnot, you to look into it in terms of, well, do I want to become a police officer, and do I want to engage in that role? And it's important for Muslims to be able to do that, right? Where we have, even now, we have sisters wearing hijab that are actually now engaged in becoming police officers and whatnot. And there's a lot to navigate there in terms of ensuring that you have the family support and ensuring that you have the right understanding of what the job entails, etc. And that's for each individual sort of to make that determination for themselves. But to be able to have these engagements where they can actually, community members, you want to know about the RCMP, you want to meet members of the London Police Service, here they are. They're going to come to our mosque, and you can come and you can have a conversation with them, and etc. And we start at the level of the community leaders, and then we can bring it down to the congregation, where in that instance where we had the senior command of the London Police Service come to the mosque, we went into the school afterwards, and the officers got to interact with the children in the school. I mean, we have a chief in London. Is a wonderful chief, and he's a visionary leader, Chief Trung. And the number of times that he's engaged on the ground with the various communities to be able to show us, like, we're not just talking the talk, we're walking the walk. There was a gathering, for example, of the Bangladeshi community, that it's an annual gathering that they have at the London Muslim Mosque, and they invited the police chief, and he accepted their invitation, and he came and he addressed the community members, and he played with the children, right? All of these they do wonders in terms of breaking down these barriers. And it's just like, here you have the chief of police, and it's not just him. There's within the police force that will do this, but it's just to show at that level of leadership. This is the highest position within the London Police Service, and there's that level of engagement within the community, right? It's got to be proactive. It's not something that is passive. And so we have to invite. They accept their invitation. They invite us. We accept their invitation. We have these dialogues. We have these interactions. We have these meals together, right? All of these things go many, many strides to break down sort of this sense of mistrust, and they'll come in uniform, right? To be able to say, it's like, okay, this is we're doing our job, but at the same time we're engaging with our community. Now, it's not to say that there aren't incidences that happen that are negative or whatnot, but now we have an open door of communication. If these things happen, then let's talk about it. Let's address it. And if actions need to be taken, then those actions can be taken, but there's a process in place and procedure in place to ensure that there's a thorough due diligence and vetting, and to ensure that things are as they are before sort of actions are taken, and to be able to look at things at a deeper level before any sort of actions are taken from a perspective of whether it's discipline or corrective or whatever it might be. Again, there's a process there, but it's just that community engagement. It's the to and the fro, and the back and the forth, and to be able to engage with one another. That's something that is really so essential. And I've seen that change. I've seen that develop and grow and change over my years here in London, Ontario. I've been here for the past 12 years now, because I came to London in 2013, and I've seen that change and that development and that building of these relationships, and the nurturing of these relationships, and doing the work, and to be able to talk to community members, right? And I'll tell people, I'm a chaplain with the police. You have questions, come ask me. I'll tell you about my experiences. I'll tell you, with the RCMP, same thing. Come and have a conversation with me. Let's have those conversations. Don't have sort of these preconceived notions that are unaddressed within your mind, that you have these doubts or these questions, and if there's validity to your perspectives, then I'll validate it. I'll say, yeah, actually that's true. Let's see what we can do to address it at a higher level.
MashaAllah. And just to unpack that answer in itself, it talks about the power of visibility. Because like you said, some people could just talk the talk, but walking the walk is totally different. And some people in the community might need that. Like you hear all the time people coming in, giving their pleas to the community. We're going to do this, we're going to do that, we're going to make these changes. When such person gets elected, some person gets the budget, you never see them again. So over time, especially those who've been there for a long time, lose that trust. But when you do have those conversations, plus the visibility and the actual engagement, showing that they want to make a change, it does make that change. And it's a full conversation, because for myself, I actually, after high school, I had the intention of wanting to become an officer 10 years ago. So 12 years ago, I decided to enroll in police school because I wanted to become a cop. I wanted to make that change. and I thought that I could help as far as my community. And during those 2 years, the conversations and everything that was happening in the world at that time, primarily the deaths of Trayvon Martin, Mike Brown in the US, and the Ferguson riots, that was a very pivotal time because at that time, I'm around 17, 18, 19. I'm seeing all these riots and I'm seeing that people are asking for change on a justice level, and it's not happening. And obviously, people have that reactive mentality on a micro scale, right? And at the same time, while this is happening, I'm asking my professors and my teachers who've been cops for 10, 20, 30 plus years about what are some of the changes that we could do or do you want to see, as far as obviously the context is different, primarily in Canada. And when I got their answers and their feedback and just how it works as far as the Canadian system, the Canadian context, even if the same thing were to happen here, is very similar to what you're talking about as far as the communications for those who are Muslims, as far as jihadists and stuff like that. And it's the same thing as far as like young African American males, thugs, criminals, delinquents, unintelligent and stuff like that. And on top of the issue of pardoning itself, a practice that was done against African Canadians for a long time, especially during that time.
And racial profiling.
And racial profiling. I was very disappointed, very disheartened. And once I came out of it and I graduated 10 years ago, I knew that I did not want to become a cop. Because not only was the answer not helpful, at the same time, the visibility aspect, I didn't have someone that could take me aside and be like, hey, even though you might have been disappointed here, these are the breakthroughs that we're doing to combat racial profiling, to combat carding, to have these conversations, especially where I was living at the time too, right? So because I didn't get that visibility aspect, that preconceived notion limited what I could have done as far as to make that change and that step and that progress. So I did not want to become a cop. I had a negative stigma towards it for a few years. Alhamdulillah, it's one of those things when you start doing community work and stuff like that, and you have these conversations, and you do see people eventually do those works and initiatives through different communications and organizations, you realize that that's what it takes. It just takes someone doing the job, taking the first step. They say the hardest journey in like 1,000 miles is just the first step alone. So alhamdulillah, that's why it's beautiful how you talked about that aspect as far as visibility, because now as I'm older, had that visibility back then, I would have been more comfortable and more at ease as far as finishing and actually want to become a cop as well.
Which leads us to our next topic. Thank you for those two beautiful answers. I think everyone, if you're listening, I appreciate it. We appreciate you so much. But I would love to talk about the aspect of mental health on both sides. Obviously, being a police officer, because again, you see a lot of stuff sometimes where, of course, we're not allowed to speak about it due to confidentiality. And also, as Muslims, we face mental health sometimes. There's always a stigma. There's always a taboo topic we're not allowed to talk about, especially, as you said, when you're born and raised in Canada and the West, being born Muslim or even converting to become Islam, there's a lot of taboo topics where you have to ask certain questions, but you feel like you're not getting the answer. Sometimes people will tell you, you're not praying too much, your relationship with Allah is not close. But what is your perspective on helping these young Muslims while being a chaplain, helping the police or the community work that you do integrate with these Muslims to help them with their mental health? There's a lot of things that we obviously go through now with the rise of social media and TikTok and all the other platforms that are clearly affecting our mental health of these new youth. What steps are you taking to ensure that the youth are being taken care of fully? Because sometimes they don't have that access at home.
Right. Well, I mean, I think you alluded to it in your question, where when we're talking about mental health and the stigma that's associated with it, we need to be able to address the misconceptions that exist. Right? To be able to engage and to have those conversations. I mean, the human being is a creature that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created these different aspects within us. We have our physical, we have our mental, our aql, and then we have our spiritual and our ruh, right? Our spirit and our soul. And so these are different aspects within us, and we need to ensure that we take care of each of these aspects accordingly. So it's not just about having a physical, healthy body, right, where I take care of myself and exercise regularly and eat the proper foods, etc. It's not only limited to that, because if I don't take care of my body, it has an impact on my mind, and it has an impact on my spirit as well, on my soul. And if I don't see that integration, they're intertwined with one another. They're inextricably linked. If I don't take care of my mental health, it has an impact on my physical body, on my physical health as well as my spiritual health. If I don't take care of my spirit, then it has an effect on my physical as well as on my mental. Okay, and so they're all intertwined and connected. There's an interconnection and that's the beauty of our faith tradition. I mean, when you look at the salah, it takes all these different aspects and it combines them into a perfectly balanced act of worship. that it involves the physical, it involves the mental, and it involves the spiritual. Like they're all intertwined with one another. It's not just simply a matter of sitting down, and it's not to say that there's no benefit in that, where if a person, they sit down and then they meditate, or they do actions of mindfulness or dhikr or whatnot, right? That's beautiful, and but look at this core act of worship. This is the most essential act of worship after our shahada is our salah. And look at how it beautifully balances and combines these different aspects of the human being. And there are many examples in the life of the Prophet ﷺ. I mean, the Prophet ﷺ, he experienced all these different emotions that people experience when it comes to, sadness, when it comes to anger, when it comes to happiness. How do you respond? How do you regulate? How do you deal with these different emotions? And when we look at, the history of the contributions, Muslim contributions to the sciences of the self. I mean, what's psychology in Arabic called? Do you know what psychology in Arabic is called?
I actually do not
in the Arabic
know.
language?
No, I don't know.
It's called ilmun nafs.
Okay.
Yeah, it's called ilmun nafs. What does that mean? Knowledge of the self.
Knowledge of self.
Psychology it's about understanding knowledge of the nafs, the science that is involved about the nafs. And so the Quran, there are many aspects of the Quran that talk about the self, that talk about the nafs, and how people they think and how their thinking and their perceptions have an impact in terms of their overall state or their well-being or whatnot, and then has an impact on their desires and their emotions, and then how they manifest those emotions in terms of their limbs. I mean, you have so many scholars within Islam, like Abu Zayd al-Balkhi is one of the earliest scholars in the 9th century, not Hijri, 9th century of the Gregorian calendar. This is 3rd century of the Hijra, where he's talking about the different forms of depression. That there is exogenic depression, and then there is endogenic, or based on external factors, and then based on internal factors. And he's able to, and he differentiated, between the two, to say that, okay, if it's based on external factors, meaning that the environment and what people are experiencing on the outside or whatnot, then this is where therapy in terms of talking can help. But if it's internal, if there's like a chemical imbalance, the humors are imbalanced or something of that sort within oneself, then this is where a different level of intervention or a different form of intervention is necessary, where then it's like, okay, let's look at some natural medications and whatnot that can help to reestablish that chemical imbalance to be able to reestablish a sense of balance within the body. That's extraordinary for a 9th century scholar, right? But then it goes on from there when you're talking about Imam al-Ghazali and all of the different things that he's talked about. I mean, one of the things that I'm currently doing right now is I'm going through a program to eventually become a certified psychotherapist. So it's a part-time program. But when it comes to psychotherapy, it's about dealing with sort of the mental aspects, and there's a bridging between what is known in the modern scientific fields of psychology and psychotherapy and whatnot, and mental health, and within our faith tradition. I mean, there's so many parallels that we can draw, and to say, by the way, we have this within our faith tradition, but it's implicit. And then it's just a matter of bringing it out and saying, okay, well, there's something that is more explicit. There's hadiths, and these are articles that have been written about mental health in Islam. Yaqeen Institute, for example, is a great resource for people to go to when it comes to understanding, mental health issues and whatnot. And so one of these articles talks about, the legacy of Islam within the field of mental health, and there's hadith of the Prophet ﷺ where Aisha she's reporting that when they had someone pass away in her family, and then they brought the women together, and then the Prophet ﷺ told them to have talbina, which is a specific comfort foods, right? And so recently I was just a few months ago, I was speaking to some high school youth during Ramadan, during an iftar, and so one of the social workers from the school approached me and said, we're having a struggle with the boys in particular when it comes to mental health, that they were saying the same things that you were saying, that so this is based on lack of faith, and a person doesn't have enough iman, and they're not praying enough or whatnot. And so she was concerned that they're going through a lot. The boys, they're struggling, and they're not willing to talk about their struggles. They're not willing to talk about, okay, well, what's happening within themselves and how to navigate these types of things. These are mental health issues that we're talking about. So she had asked me, would I be willing to come in and have this conversation with the boys? And I said, absolutely. And so I went in and I had 2 different presentations that were talking about mental health, that were talking about, emotional regulation and being able to navigate difficult situations and circumstances, where it's like an open, conversation and dialogue and an opportunity for them to ask questions and things like that. These levels of engagement, or these types of engagement, they're very impactful, and where people, it's just like, okay, we need to educate ourselves, where let's look at the role of prayer and the role of dua within our faith tradition and some of these spiritual aspects, but at the same time understand how I can be impacted by my environment and from a mental health perspective, and that, if people are suffering, or they are going through, different levels of depression, right, or sadness and whatnot, how do we address that? How do we navigate that? Is this something that requires a deeper level of clinical intervention, or is it something that can be addressed through therapy, just talking about it and empowering people to be able to know more about themselves? When we talk about like emotional intelligence, this is part of that as well, where it's just like I get to know my own emotions and how to regulate my emotions, and then how do I manifest these emotions within boundaries that is not going to cause violations to myself or to other people. Right. And so just having those conversations and giving examples and whatnot, really, it goes a long way.
MashaAllah, beautiful answer once again. And it's incredible how you talked about the variance and the spectrum amongst the scholars that touched these topics and have covered it a long time ago, and how this information is available to us. What's up for us to either learn from those or take upon ourselves. And this makes me wonder, because obviously we're talking about mental health, and mental health, I'm not going to say it's a new phenomenon, but obviously it's become a new thing in the past like 10 years or so, as far as the conversation, the stigmatism, and the unpacking and the undoing. But alhamdulillah, it's amazing how you want to become a psychotherapist. May Allah allow you to become one, inshallah. My goal is to become a psychotherapist as well, inshallah. So that's the goal for myself at the moment. When discussing mental health, I see like a spectrum. When you're talking about baby boomers, Gen X, millennials, because of the hardships they went through and how society was constructed during those times, it's like whatever you went through, deal with it, hold on to it, don't let it out and stuff, right? And most of the time, these things, we don't realize why we act such a way, how we are, and it explodes when it explodes. But most of the time, do not discuss it, do not frown upon it, do not lament about it or whine about it, right? But particularly with Gen Z, in this time and day and age, the world is more open, communication is more clear, more effective, more quick, and alhamdulillah, these children are able to open up. They have no parameters. There's no box as far as being limited. And they're able to share information. But while being open at the same time, they don't know how to find out what they want, who they are, and what issues that might be hindering them from being their best selves. So the Gen X, millennials, baby boomers, for them, it's like when it comes to mental health, it doesn't exist, like it doesn't exist. Stop talking about those things. Right. At the same time, for Gen Z, it's like, this is something that's very important. I need help. When you realize that both sides are reluctant, either wanting to find out what it is or being so head on and like, this is just a myth, what do you, as the person trying to find the answers, or alhamdulillah, you already have the answers, presenting something that's eloquent, balanced, and that's going to provide breakthrough on both sides? I know you touched about it upon the Gen Z, but what about baby boomers, millennials, and Gen X? That's very strong about not opening up.
Yeah, no, it's right. It's an important question, to ask. Part of my approach to this is that, when people are going through problems, and this is something that I've seen on so many different occasions in different aspects, right? So whether we're talking about mental health issues, whether we're talking about family problems or whatnot, it's usually not until an individual reaches a breaking point where a crisis ensues, or that there's something major happens, that it's just, okay, there's an issue here, I need to talk to somebody about it. When they get to that point, and then they're willing to have that conversation because they're in crisis, that's where we're able to sort of unpack and to be able to have these types of conversations, first by listening to them. And that's the first thing, that always the step is to be able to listen, not for the sake of responding, but for the sake of understanding. Right, and that as the role of a therapist, or as a community leader or counselor or whatever it might be. When we listen to people, it should be for the purpose of being able to understand where they're at. It's to listen to understand rather than to respond. And there's a difference there. And so if I'm trying to understand where they're at, what their positions are, and then to be able to engage them, even just asking basic, simple questions that would then entice thought, that would then entice introspection, and to be able to reflect on, some of their situations. Sometimes I'm put in a position where I need to challenge somebody, where it's just like they have an understanding that is clearly problematic. And then it's just like, okay, it's not about confronting them, but let me challenge them just in terms of, well, is that really the case? What about such and such? What about this? And if is this something that you'd be okay with if it was happening to, someone else? Or if you're going through this yourself, are you okay with this? You desire this for other people as well, right? And just to be able to sort of unpack and try to have these types of conversations by trying to find the right questions to ask. But it's about meeting people where they're at. Because I can't assume that people are, they have understandings of mental health issues, or they have understandings of, different aspects of the problems that they're going through. Because often enough what happens, people will come to you and they have their box of puzzle pieces. And they'll just dump the box in front of you and they say, this is my problem, right? So and that's everything. It's all just a jumbled mess. And they're coming to you with so many different things. And so then what you need to do is, okay, well, let's try to make sense of this pile of puzzle pieces, the mess that you just dumped in front of me, right? And let's try to sort through it. Because you want to put together a puzzle, you got to sort through the pieces. You got to flip over the pieces and then put them based on, color and shape and these types of things. And then, you have an ideal picture. That's the goal that you're trying to put together here, right? But you need to be able to sort through these. So let's look at your issues and try to be able to sort of categorize and put them and work through with the individual to think about these things on their own. Because it's not about, I'm not going to solve your issues, but I'd rather empower you to solve your issues, that you can do it. And that capacity is within you, right? I can provide, based on my experiences or my recommendations or advice or whatever it might be, or suggestions, etc. But at the end of the day, I can't change you. You have to change yourself. So even just to be able to provide that sense of empowerment for people, to let them know that, okay, yes, you're going through a difficult time. Let's try to sort through this and deal with these issues one by one. Because what you brought me is all these different issues jumbled together. Let's sort through them and then to try to address them, one by one. And then from there, that we can take these things step by step, and that's what our faith teaches us, to try to address things, taking things step by step, looking at the proper means, and to be able to understand the different perspectives and whatnot, and even just to be able to kind of meet people where they're at, and then walk with them as they go through and to walk alongside them as they're sorting out their issues, so to speak. That's the role of a therapist, is to be able to sort of facilitate these conversations. And, boss, they need direction. Well, let's look at what are some possible directions that we can go in. That's actually going to be of benefit and of help for yourselves, to help you get a clearer picture, so that at the end of the day, the steps that you need to take as the asbab, or as the means, and then place our trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
There's so much to unpack here. SubhanAllah, beautiful answer. And I think a couple things that stuck out to me was, one, you said regarding the therapist, like solving problems one by one. But also you mentioned earlier, sometimes when you're talking to certain people or clients that you're dealing with, they unpack, they kind of say all your problems at once, as opposed to kind of breaking it down. Similarly, I know for me, not too similar, but because I volunteer at this organization called Futurepreneurs, so sometimes I find when I'm talking to, as a mentor, talking to the mentees, helping them with their business, a lot of the time people come with their problems, but obviously in the case of mental health, it's different, right? So I feel to address stuff like domestic violence, or even addressing grief, which are two major, or even divorces, things which are much more harder to deal with, much more touchy. Sometimes people don't know where the core problem can happen, and they don't feel heard. Sometimes they feel like the advice you're giving them isn't the advice that they want to hear, because they're so emotionally attached to their own thought process, and they're having a harder time dealing with the problem. So how do you even address it? Because a lot like domestic violence, obviously, even amongst Muslims, unfortunately, it does happen. It's there, so we're not gonna say it doesn't, but unfortunately, it does happen. Even addressing stuff like grief. Sometimes we know people. A kid that we grew up with a couple years ago passed away because he was entered the wrong party, and unfortunately he had lost his life. And we know someone else who even again went to a motorcycle accident and he passed away. So I feel like, as a chaplain, what is your role in terms of addressing grief within your community, helping your community reduce stuff like domestic violence, or even amongst the younger community, when they're having uncomfortable situations, for example, like, pornography or drugs or alcohol, things which now become more
Yes.
prominent in high
Major
school.
issues.
And they're like, I can't go to my dad and ask, I want to go to you. It was true, because you even see people amongst their 20s and 30s have these conversations because their parents are not giving them an open conversation. So I guess if you could talk about all that
Sure.
briefly.
Well, Jazakallah khairan for bringing up those very important, critical issues that we do need to address within our communities. I mean, the work that I was doing for 6 years at the Muslim Resource Center for Social Support and Integration, this is a social service agency. It's not a religious institution. It's a social service agency where I was providing the faith-based perspectives and supports in a social service context. It's a unique model that the Muslim Resource Center operates on or using, which is a culturally integrated family safety response. That's the model that was developed by the founder of the Muslim Resource Center, Dr. Muhammad Dawood. And so that model of a culturally integrated approach when it comes to a family safety response, part of that culturally integrative approach is to be able to understand the faith-based perspectives. And so this is a family safety agency. And so people would come to the MRC, and then I would be able to, alongside the social workers or the psychotherapists, I would provide them with some of the faith-based supports and perspectives. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I did there was I also developed a series of sermons, khutbahs, Friday khutbahs, on domestic violence. And it was published through the Muslim Resource Center, as well as through a grant from Islamic Relief Canada. And so when I put together this, it's 7 khutbahs, and each khutbah would address a different or particular aspect of domestic violence. The first thing that we need to do is we need to talk about it at this level on a community level. Okay, we need to address these issues on the minbar. And if we're not addressing these issues on the minbar, and any time that I would deliver these sermons, almost without exception, somebody would come up to me afterwards and say, I'm glad you addressed this. I have something that I'd like to talk to you about. And I would direct them to the Muslim Resource Center, and then they would come and we'd have these conversations, etc. But I mean, you said it yourself, where domestic violence, for example, is not something that, it does happen in our community, but it's not something that is a Muslim problem. It's not something that is a problem that is related to Islam or something of that sort. And again, that sometimes it's a misconception where, Muslims are more prone to domestic violence and Muslim men are more prone to committing acts of violence, etc. No, this is a human problem. This is not based on faith. This is not based on ethnicity. This is not based on a particular demographic. This is a human problem, and so we need to tackle it as such. First step is becoming educated, is to be able to inform ourselves and to be able to understand the complexities that exist within this issue and the different layers that exist. Same thing when it comes to mental health and addictions. I've delivered sermons that address mental health and addictions. And that's another series that I want to also develop, that I have an outline of several sermons that address addictions and the nature of addictions, because you have, substance-based addictions, and then you have behavioral addictions like pornography or like gambling or whatnot, all of which we, members of our community struggle with. Nobody wants to talk about it. And so if we're not willing to talk about these things, and people are just sitting during the Jummah khutbahs and they're having all these issues and they're suffering in silence and they don't know how to address it, then, how will they know that there are actually resources that can help provide support? How will they be able to understand that I'm suffering from this issue, I need help, who do I go to? Who do I speak with? Right? Because these things, they actually become, intergenerational. They're widespread throughout the community, but then it impacts not just one generation. It actually, when you're talking about the various generations, if you've had dysfunctional families for decades, where you have like the great grandparents, and they had a dysfunctional relationship, but that was their experience of marriage. And then the the grandparents, who then they took those same patterns and then they're applying it within their lives, and then the children, and then the parents and the children, and it becomes intergenerational, where it's just like, okay, at what point are we going to understand that, by the way, there are certain elements of this that aren't Islamic, and that is not part of the sunnah of our Prophet ﷺ, and that we need to change. And we need to stop the cycle. We need to break this cycle of whether it's domestic violence, whether it's addictions or whatnot. How do I do that? Because these are age-old problems, right? It's not like these are things that are new in our times, but there are certain dynamics that are new. right? Like, for example, the ease of accessibility when it comes to social media and to be able to access explicit material and pornography and these types of things. The ease, I mean, any child, any adolescent who has a cell phone and access to a Wi-Fi signal can get access to hardcore pornography. And this is very frightening. What do we have in place? Are we having these conversations with our children? Where we're talking, by the way, you start going down this direction, this is going to cause a lot of harm. This is going to be, very detrimental to your own well-being, whether it's physically, emotionally, spiritually, mentally. It impacts all these different aspects of the human being, as I'd mentioned, because they're all intertwined with one another. And so if people don't understand sort of the risks involved, and if we're not having these conversations because they're taboo, and they need to happen on the minbar, and I'll say that straight up, and I'll talk about these things on the minbar to be able to address these issues, that it's a starting point. It's not the end goal. But we need to start having these types of conversations. And individuals, including khatibs who are going to breach these issues, they need to also become aware and work on ensuring that they're properly informed. That's why I developed this as a resource for khatibs, so that it's like, okay, they can read through it and then to be able to prepare themselves to address this on a community level, and that if they are aspects or elements that they don't necessarily have the experience to be able to address, then direct it towards an individual, an organization, an institution that does have that expertise and that can address these issues from that perspective, because we also need to know our limits, right? I can't deal with hardcore addictions if I don't have that experience as an addictions therapist to be able to understand the nature of addictions and how they come about and the impacts that it has on the brain and how it changes the brain and all that. If I don't have that level of knowledge and understanding and expertise, I could actually be doing more harm than good if I'm trying to quote unquote solve this person's issues when they approach me. So I also need to know my limits and to be able to direct them towards individuals specialists who we can walk alongside one another. I can talk about the faith-based cultural aspects, and you can talk about the clinical aspects, and let's walk along together to support this individual that is going through this challenge in their lives because of this issue that they're dealing with, whether it's addictions or pornography or domestic violence, etc. Right? But the first step is spreading awareness, education.
Definitely.
That's the first thing that
Definitely.
we need to do.
SubhanAllah, I love something you said regarding how youth and social media, and it's interesting because I'm the youngest out of all my coworkers, and I remember they were talking about their kids and they're scared about what they're doing at home with their friends, and I started laughing hysterically, like, why are you laughing? This is not a joke. I'm like, the reason I'm laughing is because you should be checking their phones. Because I'm like, if you go on TikTok, or you go on Instagram, you see even Twitter, whatever social media platform there is, they're showing almost pornography on those platforms where they are purposely paying these content creators money in order for you to keep watching, in order for them it starts stimulating your brain. And sometimes, subhanAllah, I was watching a sheikh and an imam, he was mentioning how it's important if you've seen certain things, that, like, for example, myself and Muhammad here, we grew up, been amazing friends since the age of 6. We've known each other for a long period of time. So we always talk about how when we see younger kids, we want to educate them. Because a lot of them, they think that they're powerful. And of course, everybody at a certain young age, they think they're indestructible. They think that they're better than their friends. And I believe I always tell this to the younger parents. I'm like, be careful who their friends are. But also, I told this to a lot of people, go see what on their phone is. Because sometimes you don't know what they're doing. They're not aware of what they're doing. As you mentioned eloquently, it affects you spiritually, mentally, physically. Aside from stuff like pornography, even drugs, the amount of stuff that I think the first week of high school, in 2009, the first week someone passed away due to drunk driving, and that scared me a lot. I'm like, Muslim or not Muslim, I'm never touching alcohol in my life. Because I'm like, you died the first week I entered high school. And I remember they took us to the tree where he crashed a car, and his mom went through all the Halton region and kind of spoke about not to drink and the dangers of drinking. So I feel like it's important, as you said, for Muslims, even young Muslims as well, if you've experienced certain stuff and go speak to this young generation, because if you educate them and you put that fear in them, it helps them say, oh, I'm gonna stay away from this.
Right. No, for sure. And the awareness is something that is really important. But another thing that I would also bring sort of awareness to is if parents discover these things, for example, on their children's phones, or that they're engaged in certain activities, risky behaviors or whatnot, how do they respond? Because that response can actually either help to allow the child to be able to open up and have these conversations, or it can actually turn them away. And I've seen that happen where there's a disconnect. There's a generational gap in terms of, parents understanding. And it's not to blame parents, right? I don't want people to misunderstand. It's not about blaming parents, but it's about understanding what factors can contribute to being able to connect and have these conversations with children, and the approach that we take, as opposed to building a wall and turning them away, and then they go off the wayward, and we have no idea what's going on.
Yeah.
Because there's that barrier, that gap. And so it's important, and not all parents can actually address these issues because they're so complex, or they don't know how to navigate it. And so then my suggestion and recommendation is, okay, fine, reach out to those supports that do exist where they can help you to navigate, and then provide that opportunity for the children to have those conversations with a counselor, with an imam that is qualified, or with another community leader, et cetera, that has knowledge and experience, et cetera. But with the caveat that there's qualification. They're qualified. They're not just, anyone who doesn't necessarily have knowledge or experience. No, it's really important that they have knowledge and experience to deal with these things, so that they're able to sort of walk alongside with the youth that's struggling. And that sense of community involvement, or, having youth workers that will come to the masjid and have a session where you talk about pornography, you talk about addictions. I've had sessions in the masjid where I'm talking to youth about these things, and talking about how addictions work, and some resources to help address them, or how to navigate these situations or scenarios. Again, it starts with that sense of awareness, and then if the further steps need to be taken, then opportunities are provided to allow them to get the support that they need to help address and navigate these difficulties and these challenges that they're going through. Because they're real, and they're happening, and they're widespread.
I think the response is definitely important, the way parents respond. Like, for example, if you catch your, for example, kid having cigarettes, or like, just for the sake of conversation, they were watching pornography. At this point, rather than screaming at them and scaring them, you should break it down, because of course these are obvious matters that happens amongst any religion or any culture. It doesn't matter who you are. It's bound to happen within certain communities. But as you said, the response is really important to show them, okay, now they're curious. Let me go have a conversation with them. Because you got to start differentiating between real and fake. And that's really important, I believe, as you said that. I think our mosque also has like youth nights where they speak about topics. I'm not sure in terms of the depth, in terms of they do touch on taboo topics, but I believe it is important regardless of what the topic it is. Yes, it is uncomfortable, but at least you know that you did your job in terms of mentioning to them this is what it is, and if they responded negatively, or if they still do it, that's on them. You gave them the information, you told them that it's harmful, and whatever they take from it is whatever they take from it.
Before we let you go, there's one thing we want to do. We just have a small mini game, is where we ask different questions just to get know more about personality and also your preference as well. So the first question is,
aside from Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who's another prophet that you look up to, that you love?
I love the story of Isa alayhi salatu wasalam, because it's something that resonates deeply with me, especially in our times, because he was known as Ruhullah. He was known as the spirit of Allah, meaning that the spirit that Allah imbued in Maryam without a father. And so this is something that when we look at, Isa was the epitome of spirituality in his time, because there was a lot of, sort of almost materialism that existed in his time. And so he came to be able to remedy that. And so he came as the Ruh Allah, in terms of bringing back these different aspects or elements where there's a disconnect from, the spiritual realm. And his role was to be able to bring people back into that. And it was in his very creation, salam, that element was brought. And I just find that that's something that we really need in our time. Like, because of the materialism and the secularism that exists in our time. And this is one of the wisdoms, wallahu ta'ala alam, in terms of Isa alayhi salam coming back. Because he will return at the end of time. And he's going to return at a time where there's such a huge divide and divorce of the spiritual from the material, and it's about reshaping and rebalancing that focus, where it's like, don't lose sight of the spiritual aspects, don't lose sight of our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And of course all of that message is imbued in what our Prophet ﷺ brought, but it's something that really resonates deeply with me in terms of the persona of Isa alayhi salatu wasalam, and who he was and whatnot. But I mean, I could have named any of the prophets, to be honest with you,
Yeah.
in this regard, but it's something that really had resonated with me at the moment.
For the next question, instead of one, you could do five if you want, because it's very tough. I was going to mention who are some of your favorite Islamic scholars, examples such as like Abdullah ibn Mubarak, or Sufyan al-Thawri, or Imam al-Zuhri, rahimahullah. Who are some of your favorite classical contemporary scholars?
So one of my favorite is Imam al-Nawawi, rahimahullah. He was such a giant within our faith tradition. He's a Shafi mujtahid, and I studied Shafi fiqh, although my parents, they raised me and they practice Hanafi fiqh. But when I was provided with an opportunity to study Shafi fiqh, I studied it, and I've been practicing the Shafi madhab ever since. Rahimahullah is a Shafi scholar of the highest caliber, but he was also a very spiritual individual. I've taught some of the books of Imam al-Nawawi, which really are profound books when it comes to, for example, his Maqasid, Kitab al-Maqasid, which is what I'm currently teaching at this point in time. It goes through the basics of Islam. The first chapter is on Aqidah, and then the next 7 chapters are on the fiqh, and then the last chapter is on tasawwuf, or spirituality, and he calls it that, tasawwuf, which is his chapter on purification of the self. So Imam Nawawi is an extraordinary scholar. But another scholar who also is very equally influential in my life is Imam al-Ghazali, rahimahullah. I've taught his book, The Bidayat al-Hidayah, which is an extraordinary work, the beginning of guidance. And because it's something that is almost like a summary, and it's bringing out the cream of the crop of his most significant work, which is the Ihya Ulumuddin. So he wrote the Bidayat al-Hidayah after his Ihya Ulumuddin, and so you can see the Bidayat al-Hidayah as almost like a summary of the core, the crux of his Ihya Ulumuddin. So it's a wonderful book, and it's something that, when you read through it, if it doesn't shake you, then there's something off with it in terms of your spirituality. If this book doesn't shake you, if it doesn't give you that wake-up call, and reading it once is not enough. You have to read it through several times. But it's something that really should shake you within, because it's just like, okay, I need to get my priorities straight.
Yeah.
So Imam al-Ghazali, and this is based on his experience, like what he's talking about and what he's writing about is experiential. He went through his own, crisis and whatnot, and he wrote about it in his Munqadh min al-Dalal, but he's another extraordinary scholar. And then, of course, there's the most prolific scholar in Islamic history is Imam Suyuti, rahimahullah, as another scholar that is profoundly influential, and he's written a number of different works and whatnot that are of great relevance within the Islamic sciences. So those are 3, and I'll leave it at that.
What is your favorite chapter in the Quran? Like, what's one chapter that stands out to you?
Well, I mean, the Fatiha is the first
Yeah.
one, because that is the greatest surah in the Quran. It's something that we read on a daily basis, and often we take it for granted in terms of it just, the 7 oft-repeated verses. But it's something that there's so much meaning and depth within it. Another chapter, of course, is Surah Al-Ikhlas. It's one of my favorite, of course, in terms of providing that basic understanding of what life is all about Allah. And I always say to people to ask themselves this fundamental grounding question in anything and everything that you go through. Who is this all about? Who does your universe revolve around? And the answer is one of 2 answers, and there's not a third answer, and they're both mutually exclusive. It's either about Allah, and everything is revolving around Him, or it's about the nafs. Surah Al-Ikhlas, it is that. This is about Allah, and it gives you that sense of sincerity, and that to be able to give us that, our direction, that we're all going to Allah, and we need to turn to Him constantly, and be seeking Him, subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it's 4 very short verses, but again, profound in meaning. But, I mean, it's a hard question to ask, because there's so many different
Definitely.
surahs of the Quran that there's so many lessons in them, and the story of Yusuf, or Surah Ibrahim, and Surah Al-Ra'd, and there's so many. Like the Quran is an endless ocean of wisdom and beauty and knowledge.
What's your favorite food?
I like Syrian cuisine because I'm originally from Homs, from Syria. And so I grew up with Syrian cuisine. And so one of my favorite foods is wara anab bil lahma, which is grapevine leaves wrapped with, stuffed with rice and meat that's over a bed of lamb. You can use beef or veal or whatnot.
Yeah.
But then with the sauce, sort of the mar'a that comes with that little bit of the rose water flavor
Yes.
that is imbued in the meat and then the wara anab. It's for me, that's one of my favorite dishes.
That's my favorite dish. I can agree with you 100%.
MashaAllah.
I will say, mashallah, Bilad al-Sham, that's amazing with wara anab.
Yeah.
And I'll
yeah,
put a stamp on it. My second
Yeah.
question for you. My second question for you is, what do you like to do on your off time, your hobbies-wise?
I mean, I like to walk, and sometimes I'll play some sports. I love basketball. It's my favorite sport. I'm getting old, and so it shows. But just I like to sort of to keep active, but also spending time with the family, walking out in nature, being able to reflect on Allah's creation. These are hobbies that deeply resonate with me and help me to get through the day to day and to ground myself. And then looking into different topics, Islamic issues and whatnot, reading up on them and things like that. That's also something that I enjoy doing.
For basketball, who's your favorite player of all time?
I look at it from the perspective of, in terms of the skill, but not necessarily in terms of the personality. And I want to make that caveat because as soon as, like Michael Jordan, I was influenced, by his skill growing up. But from a personality perspective, it's not something that I would encourage people to be influenced by because, when people, they get to that level, it becomes difficult to stay humble and whatnot. But at the same time, some of the things, the language that is used and the perspectives and whatnot, they're un-Islamic. So, as a skill set, that's what is most impressive about him in terms of the basketball skills. But I want to ensure that caveat of saying that just because you look at Michael Jordan as being the best basketball player, there are a lot of concerns or issues that need to be addressed from an Islamic perspective when it comes to certain attitudes and things
definitely.
like that. We need to be able to ensure that is
his trash talk will go a little bit too far sometimes, unfortunately.
yeah.
And it's un-Islamic, definitely.
And by the way, and even how people have described him, it's completely it's absolutely unacceptable. That it's shit straight up.
100%.
So we reject 100%. That 100%.
I'm not sure.
I would have nothing to do with that whatsoever.
And the thing is too, just a little off topic, just to add on to your point. I'm not sure if you did watch it, the last Dance, the documentary about Michael Jordan, but I did watch it during the COVID times. There's a huge difference between the player. Again, Michael Jordan is an amazing player. No one can ever take that away from him. But subhanallah, the people have said about his personality, him as a person, wasn't the most kindest words. So I would say, for example, if you're in a position of power, you always want people to also speak about your character, because we know as a Muslim, your character goes a long way. You can pray 5 times a day, but if someone says something bad about you, you're 5 times a day between you and Allah, but how are you viewed amongst the community?
It's true.
Yeah. And and we do have some role models that they've gone through their journeys. So when you look at Muhammad Ali, Allah yarhamhu, what he was when he in his boxing prime, and then afterwards, and what he became, and the influence that he had. I would look at also Habib Nurmagomedov in a similar fashion, where he reached the top of his sport with obviously all the caveats that come with fighting in MMA, etc. From an Islamic perspective. But he also recognizes the power of the influence that he has, and how he's able to maintain his humility and his identity as a Muslim, and to be able to use that as a platform to positively influence other people. Right. And his journey, continues. May Allah protect him and all the other influential Muslims. But you hammered the nail on the head when you're talking about the character. That is 100%. The core of what must define us as Muslims, because that is the key thing that will grant us salvation on the day of judgment.
Definitely.
Husn al-khuluq and taqwa Allah.
Yeah.
These are the 2 aspects that our Prophet ﷺ said were the weightiest things on our scales on Yawm al-Qiyamah. Good character and deep mindful awareness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
And before we end, I just want to add on to one point you said, because subhanAllah, today, Friday prayer, Salat al-Jum'ah, not sure if you remember, the Sheikh was saying regarding there's going to be a time where people will take away deeds from you because you either upset them or you hurt them. So it's kind of saying that the reaffirmation, be good to people, make sure that everything is with the fact of your humility, great character.
Yes.
A lot of the times also too, just to add on quickly, I feel like regarding character, it's so easy to just wake up every morning and be nice to people versus trying to ruin someone's
Sure.
day. So having that reassurance, inshallah, will obviously help us. But we want to thank you so much for taking that time to speak with us today. Allahumma barak. We had an amazing conversation.
Amen.
So knowledgeable, inshallah. We would love to have you back again. How about your thoughts?
Incredible episode, mashallah, jazakallah khair. May Allah reward you. And once again, I think everything we talked about, so much different topics, but it helped identify whatever issue you're going through, micro, minor, like any type of level, you're able to unpack it. You're able to talk to someone. You're able to deal with it. If you don't know where to go to, something like the Muslim resources, like that unique framework exists. It might exist where you are, but you can always reach out, send an email, give a phone call, or even your local imam as well, your local masajid as well. Like these things are there, they're resources, they're hubs to help us. It's no different from the time of the Prophet ﷺ and the companions. They would be together all the time. It was a brotherhood. They had questions, they explained what they were going through, they talked about each other's problems, and the unpacking and these issues and these dilemmas are what we're used to today. To know what to do, whereas know what not to do. So we must reach out, we must be uniformed, and we must also have trust in those who are doing the work, as far as working with other organizations that you might have a negative perception about. But by having those conversations and that visibility, inshallah is able to provide that breakthrough for you on a humble level and a gratitude level. So once again, we thank you so much. And if anybody wants to reach out to you, how can they do it?
I mean, just reach out via email. That my email, atwakkal@gmail.com, and then we can go from there, inshallah.
Sounds